Well, it goes to what we've been talking about for a long time, and that is, yes, AI sucks up all the air out of the room, but the vast majority of what the average enterprise IT organization is focused on a day-to-day basis has nothing to do with any of that. It's
Mhm.
based on all this blocking and tackling and executing and figuring out how to solve some of these problems that have been plaguing the IT organization for decades, generations now. And in fact, we have two articles that we will wrap up on that sort of talk about two of those things. And I'm really curious. I brought one of the articles, you brought the other, and so I'm curious your take on them. But one is this idea of succession planning. Now, this article was actually about how Intel, and we talked about them last week, and all the challenges they're going through. And this article is sort of making the case about what they call, I've never heard this, the four wrong CEO rule. But you made the case offline that well, it probably applies to a CIO too. And when you said that, it's like a light bulb went off. Yeah, okay, I can see this. So this idea of succession planning, something that CIOs have been super, super bad at historically. And then the other one is an article from CIO that honestly is a bit of a nothing burger article, but it's just talking about the fact that despite all this stuff going on, despite the impact that we're seeing around things like tech debt, that CIOs still are not making it a priority and they're not dealing with it. And these are, going all the way back to the data analytics side, right? This is the stuff that is consuming so much energy. And those CIOs that get this sort of blocking and tackling right, are the ones that are making a difference. So I'm curious. I know why I brought up my article, but what did the Intel one say to you?
Yeah. So for the first article you mentioned brings up that basically four CEOs, the concept that four CEOs, bad CEOs, can mess up a company. Bring up Intel as an example. So we've been talking for a while now about the chip wars and how Intel is unfortunately struggling. They've had their layoffs and all of this, but that honestly, if you ask people in tech, does Intel have a good CEO right now? Most of them would still say yes. His the background that he has running VMware and his prior record as an Intel executive showed that he has the right stuff to be able to actually run Intel, but he is dealing with the business debt, the decision debt of multiple bad executives that were in the middle that have ended up messing up Intel's growth capabilities. And I feel that that has been a challenge across the board that is hidden in other companies because we don't necessarily track CFOs, CIOs, CMOs in quite the same way. But it can be easy for a streak of bad executives in one area to really tank a company. And I think that's something that's important to look at the CIO level because we often, frankly, it's amazing to see how many CIOs have gotten their job almost accidentally. They were not on a career track to become the CIO, but they became the CIO either because the company needed them or they were transferred from the CFO or some other executive position to help clean up the IT office. And that lack of strategy associated with the CIO office can be a real challenge because we are in a digital age where the strategic view on technology is now part of the long-term valuation of a company. And so there should always be some way to figure out who should the next CIO be, whether that's an internal candidate or an external candidate. There should always be somebody in mind for who's got next, and in a worst case scenario.
Well, and that what I found so fascinating when we each brought these two separate articles, and as I sort of processed them, is how truly interconnected they are. Because in the case of a CIO, what is a bad CIO going to do? Probably going to accumulate a whole bunch of tech debt that then, as gosh, I just forgot her name, but she wrote a book the time that my first book came out, and she described tech debt as the albatross hanging around the neck of the current CIO, decisions that were made, and it's ironic. I think she said three or four CIOs prior, right? And that's what happens, and that's what I mean. Not all tech debt is that. Part of it's just the velocity and whatever, but a lot of tech debt is that I'm making these expedient decisions in the moment and not really looking at that strategic view. And it's an interesting question. Does a CIO have the same level of impact that a CEO does? Can a CIO, four bad CIOs, in fact, tank a company? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I will know. I will say that I am 100% sure that four bad CIOs can absolutely cripple a company, absolutely tie their hands and make it almost impossible for them to compete, and where they're just sort of then having to kind of move along and hope that something changes. So I think it's really interesting, and if you're a CIO listening to this, my big takeaway is you need that strategic perspective. You need to be looking at this. You need to be tackling some of this historical legacy tech debt, whatever you want to call it. But that you're actively looking to the future and saying, what does my architecture, what is my environment, what does my culture need to look like, so that you don't become one of the chain of four bad CIOs that leads to the crippling of your company.
Yes. And one of the biggest challenges across for the CIO, of course, is technical debt as well. So this idea that you will be hindered by technical debt is not a new one for the CIO. Everybody talks about technical debt, but oddly, I feel like it's one of these topics that ends up getting a lot of lip service rather than a lot of activity. And often the challenge around technical debt ends up being turned into whether companies should move to the cloud or not. And it kind of starts and ends there rather than a more holistic perspective of what does up-to-date technology look like and how do we keep from being siloed into all of these different areas, or choosing a bunch of interesting functional best-in-breed solutions that don't play well together, or choosing a bunch of strategic vendors that may not work well together at the end of the day.
Well, and I think what is interesting, going all the way back, and this is why I love that you brought this article forward, and it helped me sort of think through it, is that the reason that tech that gets that is the can that keeps getting kicked down the road, is that it's really hard to get political credit for changing the oil, which is sort of what this is the equivalent of when we talk about tech debt. You end up modernizing, you end up refreshing, and the end state is you rarely are delivering any new functionality and any new value to the business on the surface. And so I think, if I were to go back and look in this article that you had several examples, um, it is that sort of short-sightedness that causes those problems. It's not that they're bad people, they're dumb people, they're clearly not. It's that they fail to see the longer term strategic ramifications of an opportunity that they were presented. And it's often rooted in, I'm a big fan of the late Clayton Christensen's work around disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation, and how you end up in a large enterprise in this conflict because you are encouraged and incentivized to protect your current state. And so, I think that we see these sort of situations, and those that are successful in breaking the tech debt cycle, in driving that sort of change, are the ones that are able to take these things that are the oil changes, that the stuff that just you got to get done, but you're not getting political credit for, and transform them, to put them in a wrapper where it is in fact something that is meaningful to the business and therefore can get funding and can actually have an appreciable impact within the organization. And that's a challenge, but it's a whole lot easier said than done. And that's but I think that's what separates the wheat from the chaff on this.
Yeah, and I think there's these two important buckets to keep in mind, and you need to be able to get credit for both of them. One is around sustainable innovation and sustained support, as well as that transformative change. From a financial perspective, our firm, Amalgam Insights, talks about the IT rule of 30, which says that any unmanaged IT spend category typically has about 30% in waste. But that's considered kind of ongoing sustainable operations. Nobody really gets credit for cutting costs by 20 or 30%. The other side is that sometimes there are these opportunities to cut costs 70, 80, 90% in tech, but that usually means that you are changing something where you have a lot of technical debt. What it really means is that you are 2 or 3 generations behind in that particular area. And then, yes, you have this 90% opportunity. And ironically, sometimes you'll get more credit for that 90% savings, but that 90% savings actually means that you've been doing a bad job for a decade.
Or at least
Just
somebody has. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So sometimes you have to position that 20% as being better in some ways because it means that you have been doing a decent job, but just fell a little behind. Whereas the 90% stuff typically means you are cleaning up a big mess, probably from 3 CIOs ago.
Exactly. So hopefully those are the words of wisdom if you're a CIO that cause you to step back and take a fresh look at all this, because this is the important stuff. So